I've always considered myself a careful man. I check the locks 3 times, I make sure the doors are always secure, and I run through an internal checklist every night before bed. It's not because I'm paranoid. I just like knowing everything is in its place, that we're safe. That's probably why Claire had never minded my little quirks. She'd often roll her eyes at me when I checked the windows, making sure they were shut, or when I adjusted the deadbolt just to be sure. But she didn't mind. She loved me in her way, and I loved her in mine. One evening, after a conversation with a colleague about a break-in in the neighborhood, I decided to install a doorbell camera. It seemed like a small, logical step. I didn't want to live in constant fear, but it felt good knowing we had something in place that could alert us in case of an unexpected visitor. Claire, as usual, was skeptical. "You seriously think someone's going to come up here and ring the doorbell?" she asked, laughing lightly as she stirred something in a pan in the kitchen. Her voice always had this calming quality to it, and even when she was mocking me, I found myself enjoying the sound. "Not just the doorbell," I replied, a little defensive. "It's about knowing what's going on around the house. If someone's lurking out there, I want to see it." She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue further. She wasn't the type to question my decisions on things like this, even if they seemed a little excessive. After all, it was for our safety. "All right," she said with a smile. "Just don't get obsessed with it, okay?" I set about installing the camera the next day. I'd ordered one online, one that was simple, reliable, and came with decent reviews. It wasn't one of those expensive models, but it was enough. As I drilled the screws into the side of the porch and mounted the camera, I felt a little thrill. This was going to make me feel better, I told myself. The idea that I could watch the front door from my phone, even when I was away at work, gave me a small sense of control over my environment. "All done," I called to Claire as I finished the installation. "Now we'll always know when someone's at the door. It's just peace of mind." She peeked her head around the kitchen door, smiling. "You're really getting into this, huh?" I laughed. "Just making sure we're covered." That night, after a quiet dinner together, I synced the camera to my phone and started fiddling with the app. It was easy enough to set up, and within minutes, I had a live feed of our porch at my fingertips. The image was clear, even in the dim light from the street lamp. It was almost too easy. I found myself glancing at it more than I should have, watching the empty porch, the wind making the branches sway slightly, the occasional car passing by. It felt good to know I could check it whenever I wanted. Claire didn't seem to mind. In fact, she went to bed early, her usual routine, while I stayed up a bit longer, just to check things out. There was something oddly comforting about it. "Don't get too caught up in it," Claire had teased as she kissed me goodnight. "I won't," I said with a smile, though I had already started scrolling through the app again. It wasn't that I didn't trust Claire, I just liked having everything in my control. Even a small thing, like a doorbell camera, gave me peace of mind. I could feel the tension from my long day at work start to melt away as I watched the stillness of the empty porch. I set the phone down on the coffee table and got ready for bed. But even as I drifted off to sleep, something lingered in my mind, something I couldn't quite explain. I chalked it up to the odd feeling of unfamiliar technology in our home. Maybe it was just the newness of it all, or the idea that I could now be constantly aware of everything around the house. I had this nagging sensation in my gut that something wasn't quite right, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just a result of being overtired. I had a night shift at the hospital the next evening, and as I prepared to leave, I gave Claire a kiss goodbye. She was still in the kitchen, sipping on her coffee, as she always did when I left. She waved me off, as usual, with a simple, "Be careful." It was a routine we had settled into over the years of our marriage. Quiet, comforting, predictable. At least, that's how I saw it. I had no reason to doubt anything. Still, as I stepped out the door and into the car, I found myself glancing back at the house. The front porch looked dark and empty, but something inside me still didn't feel quite right. The strange unease from last night had followed me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The night shift at the hospital is usually quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones after a long day. It's easy to lose track of time when you're surrounded by the hum of machines and the shuffle of nurses and orderlies going about their tasks. But that night, I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to the camera I had installed the day before. It was silly, I told myself. There was nothing to worry about. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At 1:30 a.m., I slipped into the break room, hoping to grab a few minutes to unwind. I pulled out my phone, checking it almost out of habit now, more than anything. The screen lit up with a notification. Motion detected at the front door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, at least not this late, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the notification. The feed loaded, and the first thing I noticed was the porch light casting long shadows. There was someone standing there, a figure in the frame, though I couldn't make out who it was. They were standing in front of the door waiting. I froze, squinting at the screen. Who was that? A neighbor? A late-night delivery? I rubbed my eyes and zoomed in, but the resolution wasn't enough to clearly make out their features. It was a man, that much was certain. I watched, barely breathing, as the figure seemed to linger, unmoving. After a few moments, he rang the doorbell. I could hear the faint chime through my phone's speakers. The sound echoed in the quiet of the break room, making my heart race. Why was he standing there for so long? It didn't seem right. Most people would ring the doorbell and move on, especially if it was late at night. This person was different. Then I heard Claire's voice, muffled through the microphone. "Hi," she said, sounding surprised but polite. "Can I help you?" The man responded, though his words were indistinct. I could only catch snippets of the conversation, but the exchange seemed to go on longer than I expected. Normally, Claire would have made a quick greeting and either sent someone away or offered assistance. But this felt like more than just a casual interaction. I leaned forward, staring intently at the screen, my stomach tight with an uncomfortable feeling. The man shifted on the porch, but I still couldn't make out his face. My thumb hovered over the phone screen, willing the camera to zoom in more, to reveal more details. But it was useless. The low light and the slight graininess of the footage were making it difficult to see clearly. Finally, after a few more seconds of silence, Claire opened the door wider. She stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment the screen went black. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. What just happened? Why did Claire let him inside? I couldn't help but wonder. The logical part of me told me to calm down. She was just being friendly, right? She wouldn't let anyone inside who wasn't trustworthy. She had a soft spot for people who needed help. Maybe he was a neighbor, someone in need of assistance. Maybe I was overthinking things, but something didn't sit right with me. I didn't recognize the man, and I couldn't remember Claire mentioning anything about someone coming over. I needed to know more, needed to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I quickly sent her a text, though I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to phrase it. "Everything okay? Who was that at the door?" I stared at the message, waiting for a reply, but it remained unread. The minutes ticked by in the break room, each one feeling like an eternity. Why wasn't she responding? I thought about calling her, but something held me back. What could I say? "I saw you let someone in. What's going on?" That didn't seem right. No, I needed to wait and see if she responded on her own. After a few minutes, I checked the camera feed again, hoping to see something that would put my mind at ease. But there was nothing. The porch was empty, the shadows stretching across the steps. It was quiet, just like it had been before. It was as if the moment I had witnessed had never even happened. I couldn't help myself. I started to second-guess everything. Was I just imagining it? I had already seen Claire let someone inside. The thought of it lingered, heavy in my chest. My head raced with possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the guy was someone she knew, someone I just didn't recognize. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I decided to check in on the feed one more time. I opened the app again, my thumb moving with a sense of urgency. The camera was still live, but I was starting to feel more and more uneasy with every passing second. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I had set up this camera to give me peace of mind, but instead it was just stirring up doubts and suspicions. I needed to hear from Claire, needed an explanation. Maybe she was just busy with something, and that's why she hadn't replied yet. Maybe I was making something out of nothing, as I had a tendency to do. But as the minutes passed and the feed remained silent, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Something was happening in our house, and I wasn't there to see it. I wasn't there to protect Claire. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed above me, but I barely noticed them. The small room felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in around me. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the phone. I was stuck in a loop, checking the camera feed again and again, hoping for clarity, hoping that something would make sense of the confusion that had settled in my chest. The next few hours at the hospital were a blur. My mind was no longer on the patients or the medical tasks at hand. I couldn't stop thinking about the footage, about Claire letting that man inside our house. I had replayed the moment over and over in my mind, each time wondering if I had missed something, something that would make sense of what I had witnessed. The hospital felt distant, like I was there physically but not mentally. My thoughts kept drifting back to her. Why hadn't she responded to my text? Why had she let a stranger in? I told myself I was being irrational. Maybe I was just tired, stressed from the long hours at work, and overthinking things. That's what I wanted to believe. The logical part of me, the part that knew Claire, told me that she wouldn't do anything wrong, that she wouldn't just invite someone in without reason. She was kind, yes, but she had a sense of caution too. It was possible she knew the man, right? Maybe a neighbor or a friend from the past, someone who had come to catch up. That's what I told myself anyway, but every time I checked my phone, my stomach twisted a little more. The more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more the thought nagged at me. The unease grew, spreading like a virus. It wasn't just about the stranger anymore. It was about the silence, the lack of communication. Claire hadn't texted back. She hadn't even bothered to check in. What was she doing? Why hadn't she answered me? I glanced at the clock, almost 4 a.m. My shift was nearing its end, but my mind was far from the quiet pace of the hospital. I hadn't seen anything else on the camera feed. The porch had remained empty, dark, and still, but I couldn't help but wonder what was happening inside our house. Was the man still there? Had they been talking the whole time? Or was it just a brief visit? I couldn't trust my instincts anymore. They were clouded by doubt, by paranoia. The more I waited, the more I felt like I was losing control of the situation. The camera had promised clarity, a way for me to monitor things when I wasn't around, but it had only left me with questions. Why had Claire let him in? What was going on in our home while I was away? I needed to know. My phone vibrated in my pocket, snapping me from my thoughts. I pulled it out quickly, eager for any message from Claire, but there was nothing. Instead, I saw the camera app had an alert. Motion detected. My pulse quickened. Was it another person? A different movement on the porch? I opened the feed, my breath catching as the camera's image loaded. But this time, there was no figure standing outside. The porch was empty, the shadows stretching long in the dim light. I scanned the footage further, my eyes darting over every corner of the screen. The image remained still, silent, without any sign of movement. But something was different now. I couldn't quite explain it, but I felt an overwhelming need to check the front door once again, as if something had changed, something I couldn't put my finger on. With one last glance, I zoomed in on the timestamp, 4:10 a.m. That was the last notification from the camera. There had been no signs of movement outside, but I felt a growing sense of urgency to get back home. The hospital was quiet now, the night winding down, but my mind was still racing. I couldn't wait much longer. I needed to see Claire. I texted her again, my fingers trembling as I typed, "Hey, is everything all right?" The message was simple, but it had taken everything for me to send it. I knew it probably sounded like I was overreacting, but the silence was unbearable. I needed an answer. Minutes passed, then another 5, then 10. Still no reply. The knot in my stomach tightened. She had never taken this long to respond. I wanted to believe she was just busy, maybe catching up with a friend or dealing with something inside. But the longer I waited, the more the doubt gnawed at me. As my shift finally ended, I gathered my things and left the hospital in a haze of exhaustion and anxiety. The world outside seemed sharper than usual, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. My phone buzzed again as I walked to my car, and for a split second, I thought it might be Claire finally answering. It wasn't her. The text was from a number I didn't recognize. My heart sank as I read it. She's not going to come back. He's been here for hours. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain struggled to piece it together, the confusion mounting. Who was this? Why would someone send me a message like this? I felt my palms grow clammy as I stared at the screen. I quickly typed a response. Who is this? What are you talking about? I waited, but the reply didn't come right away. Instead, I found myself dialing Claire's number, my fingers shaking as I tried to reach her. I had to know what was going on. Was this some kind of prank? Was this person trying to mess with me? It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I left a message, but my words felt hollow in my own ears. Claire, it's me. Call me as soon as you can. I'm on my way home. I hung up, my mind spinning. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I had to get home. Now. The drive home felt like it took an eternity. My mind raced with 100 questions, none of which I could answer. Was the man still there? Was Claire okay? And who had sent that message? I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. The house looked quiet from the outside, the porch dark and still. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that everything had changed. I wasn't sure what I would find inside, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stop until I found the truth. The house was silent when I arrived. Too silent. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The unease from earlier had turned into a tight knot in my chest. The message I'd received, she's not going to come back. He's been here for hours, kept echoing in my mind. Who was this person? What did they mean? Why hadn't Claire responded to my texts or calls? I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, my heart racing. The porch light was off, just like it had been earlier, and the front door was slightly ajar, a crack of light spilling into the dark yard. It was as if the house was waiting for me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. As I approached the door, my phone vibrated in my pocket again. I hesitated before pulling it out. It was another message from the same unknown number. He's still here. Claire's not answering. You need to hurry. My stomach turned, the words not quite sinking in. I was already moving toward the door, my mind a blur. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but whatever it was, I knew I needed to be ready for anything. I reached for the door handle and pushed it open slowly. The door creaked, the sound loud in the quiet night. My eyes scanned the hallway as I stepped inside. Everything seemed normal, no signs of struggle, no obvious signs of anything out of place. The house smelled like Claire's perfume and the faint scent of something cooking, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no movement. I called out softly, my voice trembling despite myself. Claire, are you here? The only response was the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I felt the sweat start to beat on my forehead, the weight of the situation pressing on me. Every step I took seemed to echo in the stillness. I made my way through the hallway toward the living room, my heart pounding louder with each footfall. I glanced at the camera feed on my phone once more, desperate to see something that would make sense of the situation. The live stream showed nothing unusual, just the empty porch, no movement. But the uncertainty gnawed at me, pulling at the edges of my sanity. Why hadn't Claire responded? And what had that message meant? He's been here for hours. Who was this person? And what had they done? As I reached the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting on the couch, was Claire. She was staring at the television, her body still, her face blank. For a moment, I just stared at her. There was no immediate indication that anything was wrong, but the tension in the room was suffocating. I had been so caught up in the fear of the unknown, so wrapped up in my own thoughts, that I hadn't even noticed her sitting there, so completely still. Claire, I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. I moved closer, my anxiety building with each step. Claire, what's going on? My voice was shaky now, a mixture of frustration and confusion creeping in. Who was that man at the door? Why didn't you tell me about him? Why didn't you answer my messages? There was a long pause and she still didn't react. I was beginning to feel dizzy from the pressure in my chest, the overwhelming fear that something wasn't right. My hands were clammy, my palms slick against the phone in my hand. Claire, I repeated, louder this time, my voice breaking. I reached out to gently touch her shoulder, and that was when I realized something was terribly off. Her body was cold. She didn't feel like herself. She didn't feel like she had been sitting there for hours at all. I pulled my hand back, suddenly terrified. My heart raced as I moved around to the front of the couch. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the television, but there was no life behind them. The room felt suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on me. A horrible realization was beginning to settle in. Something wasn't right. I grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her gently. Claire, wake up, I demanded. This isn't funny anymore. But the lifelessness in her eyes didn't change. A cold dread swept through me as I slowly began to back away from the couch, my legs suddenly unsteady. I fumbled with my phone trying to dial 911, but my fingers couldn't find the right numbers. I was too panicked to think clearly. Why wasn't she responding? Why was she sitting there like that? Then in a flash, something caught my eye. There was a small, almost imperceptible mark on her neck, dark and bruised. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The bruise wasn't just any mark. It was a handprint. The panic rose within me, threatening to swallow me whole. I stumbled backward, my phone now clenched in my hand as I finally managed to dial emergency services. 911, what's your emergency? My wife, she's not responding, I choked out, struggling to keep my voice steady. Please help. I think something's happened to her. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but my mind couldn't focus on the words. All I could hear was the overwhelming rush of blood in my ears. I was still staring at Claire, my mind racing to understand what had happened, when I heard the door to the back of the house creak open. I froze, unable to move. Slowly, the man from the porch, he had to be, stepped into view. He was taller than me, wearing dark clothes. His presence in the room sent an icy chill through my entire body. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway watching me. And then, in a low, cold voice, he spoke. You shouldn't have come back. The man's words hung in the air like a bad omen, filling the room with a coldness I couldn't shake. My breath caught in my throat, and I struggled to process what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to get out of the house to run, but my feet felt frozen, as if some unseen force was holding me in place. I barely registered the sound of the emergency dispatcher's voice coming through the phone in my hand. Sir, can you hear me? Help is on the way. What's the situation? But I couldn't tear my gaze from the man who now stood at the doorway, blocking my only exit. The air between us felt thick, charged with a sense of menace. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Who was he? How did he know I was coming back? And more importantly, what had happened to Claire? The man didn't seem to be in a hurry, though. He was calm, unnervingly so. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as though he was studying me, waiting for my next move. I had never seen him before, and yet something about the way he carried himself felt too familiar. There was an air of confidence, an eerie calmness to his demeanor that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. You shouldn't have come back, he repeated, his voice low and deliberate, as though each word was carefully chosen. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What did you do to her? My voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible, but it felt like a weight had been lifted just by saying it aloud. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his movement slow and deliberate. I stepped back instinctively, my back hitting the edge of the coffee table. The room felt smaller suddenly, closing in around me. He was closer now, and I could see the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't worried, not in the slightest. It was as though he had all the time in the world. I think you know exactly what happened, he said, his tone almost patronizing. You've been watching, haven't you? On that little camera of yours. The words hit me like a slap to the face. He knew about the camera. He knew I'd been watching the feed. My mind raced as I tried to piece it together, but the confusion only deepened. How had he been involved in all of this? And why was Claire just sitting there, lifeless, her body cold to the touch? I glanced at her again, unable to pull my eyes away from the sight of her sitting there, so still. The bruise on her neck seemed to stand out more now, a dark, angry mark against her pale skin. It felt like a betrayal, the image of her so vulnerable, so helpless. "Don't look at her," the man said sharply as if reading my thoughts. "It won't change anything." My mind was spinning, my thoughts crashing together in a jumbled mess. The camera, the strange messages, Claire's silence, the man's calm, unnerving presence. Everything was connected, but I couldn't make sense of it. I forced myself to focus. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think clearly. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling, but more forceful now. "What do you want?" The man's smirk deepened, and for a moment I thought he might laugh. But instead he took another step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What I want," he repeated, almost as though he was savoring the question. "I'm here to take what's mine, and you're in my way." I stared at him, trying to make sense of the words. His eyes never left mine, his gaze intense, almost predatory. It was clear now that he wasn't just a random stranger. There was something personal about his presence, something deeply unsettling. "Your way?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about? Claire is my wife. You don't belong here. You're hurting her. What do you want?" The man didn't respond immediately, and for a moment I thought he might say something else, something that would give me the answers I desperately needed. But instead he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "You're too late," he said finally, his voice cold. "You should have stayed away." At that moment I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The emergency services were on their way, but I didn't know if I'd make it out in time. The man's eyes flickered toward the door, and for a split second, I saw something that resembled hesitation, maybe even fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that same calm expression, but in that brief moment, I saw a crack in his facade. I had to act quickly. I glanced at the phone in my hand, the dispatcher still talking, but the words were just background noise now. My mind was focused entirely on the man in front of me. The sirens were closer now, but they weren't going to get here fast enough. I couldn't wait for them to arrive. I had to do something. I needed to protect Claire. Without thinking, I lunged toward him. My arms shot out, my hands grabbing for whatever I could hold on to, anything that would give me the advantage. But the man was faster than I expected. In an instant, his hands shot out, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. I gasped, the pressure in his hold crushing my bones. He twisted my arms sharply, forcing me to drop the phone to the ground with a loud clatter. "Don't try to fight me," he growled, his voice low and threatening. The sound of the sirens grew louder, almost deafening now, but it felt like time had slowed down. I was caught, trapped in his grip, struggling to break free. My mind raced. There had to be a way out. I couldn't let him take Claire. I wouldn't let him. The man's grip tightened around my wrist, the pressure unbearable. The world around me seemed to blur into a haze, and the only thing I could focus on was the coldness in his eyes. I tried to pull free, but his hand felt like iron, unyielding. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the sound of the sirens grew louder. But still, I couldn't move fast enough. "Let go of me," I grunted, trying to twist my wrist out of his hold. But the more I struggled, the harder his grip became. It was as though he was savoring my desperation, enjoying the power he held over me. "Don't bother," he muttered, his voice smooth, calm. "It won't make a difference." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized just how helpless I was. My heart raced as my eyes flickered over to Claire, still sitting motionless on the couch, her eyes wide and unseeing. The bruise on her neck stood out like a dark mark, a reminder of how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him take her. In that instant, something inside me snapped. The need to protect her, to keep her safe, overwhelmed everything else. I couldn't think of the consequences, couldn't focus on the danger I was in. All I could think of was Claire, how she had trusted me, how I had failed her by not being there when she needed me. I gritted my teeth, and using every ounce of strength I had left, I threw myself forward, using my free arm to slam into the stranger's chest. His surprise was momentary, just enough to loosen his grip. I yanked my wrist free, feeling the sting of his fingers slip away. He staggered back, caught off guard, but only for a moment. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw something darker in them. Rage, a flicker of genuine anger. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he warned, his voice low, menacing. He took a step toward me, but I held my ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think of what to do next. The sirens were so close now. Any second, they'd be here. But I couldn't wait. I couldn't let this man continue to control the situation. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could give me an advantage. And then it hit me. The doorbell camera. I glanced at the phone, now lying on the floor. The feed was still live. I quickly knelt down and grabbed it, ignoring the pounding in my chest. The phone screen flashed to life in my hand. The view from the camera was still clear, still showing the empty porch. "Who are you?" I demanded again, my voice more forceful now, the words coming out in a rush. "What do you want with her?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another step forward, his body language changing, more deliberate, less relaxed. He was preparing for something. I knew I didn't have much time. I had to act fast. I could see the front yard through the camera feed. The streetlights outside illuminated the space. And for a moment I thought I saw something. A shadow, a figure moving across the lawn. It was hard to tell, but it was enough to make my heart leap in my throat. "Help's coming," I muttered under my breath. I could feel the adrenaline surge through my veins, the fear starting to give way to something else, a sense of clarity, of purpose. I had to hold out just a little longer. The man seemed to sense my resolve, and he lunged at me, his movements fast, calculated. I reacted instinctively, sidestepping at the last second, my hands pushing him off balance. He stumbled, crashing into the coffee table. The force sent the table toppling over, sending a loud crash through the room. I didn't wait for him to recover. I grabbed the lamp from the side table and swung it at him with all my might. It connected with his shoulder, the impact knocking him back. He growled in frustration, his eyes now burning with rage. But the blow had bought me just enough time. The sound of sirens was deafening now. The flashing lights outside illuminated the house, casting long shadows through the windows. The man turned, his eyes darting to the door. He hesitated as if weighing his options. Before he could make a move, the door burst open, and uniformed officers rushed into the room. The man froze, his face twisting into a scowl as he realized his time had run out. He made a desperate lunge for the door, but one of the officers tackled him to the ground, restraining him in an instant. The room felt as though it were collapsing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I stumbled back, my body shaking with adrenaline, my legs weak beneath me. One of the officers rushed to Claire, checking her pulse and breathing. "Is she okay?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer paused, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I thought I might lose it. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. "She's alive," he said finally, his voice steady. "We need to get her checked out, but she'll be okay." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. I sank to my knees, my head spinning. I had done it. I had fought, and I had kept her safe. The man was being cuffed, his face twisted in anger as he struggled against the officers. But it was no use. He was defeated. And for the first time since I had entered the house, I finally allowed myself to exhale. As the officers took him away, I sat next to Claire, watching over her as the medical team arrived. My heart was still racing, but at least for now, she was safe. I had to hold on to that. Everything else, everything that had happened, would be dealt with in time. But for now, I just needed to hold her hand and know she was going to be okay.